It is my great honor and privilege to introduce Elspeth, Deepali, Sarah, and Thee. Our interaction, just to let everyone here know, began, I guess, began last year at the Family Camera Network that was initiated with a seminar and an exhibition, I suppose, in a public kind of a way last year, where I was very, very honored yet again to be a participant. And this initiative, I think, is extremely unique because how often do we think about photographs as something that we can deliberate and talk about, not only in a personal ways, but in sort of extra social ways, as in interactive and maybe interdisciplinary ways. One of the things I wanted to think about today, and I think everyone will present their papers, is what also happens when you have a series of photographs that are family photographs, that are acquired as family photographs by institutions. Do those photographs eventually become institutionalized? Are we going to institutionalize family histories? Is this possible to do? Should we be doing it, and how is it to be done? Because there has been a sudden and, if not critical shift over the last 10 years in the direction of personal histories, certainly. But how that kind of segues into politics, how that segues into interpersonal relationships, how are we going to think about whether the institution should be that space, hopefully productive space, where further interactions around the family are enhanced and sort of outreaches around this can be developed. I am going to show a few slides. We've had a recent engagement with Family Archives in December in this exhibition called New Futures for Passing Images Ephemeral that was hosted by the Serendipity Arts Festival, and it made us think about micro and macro level modalities at which archives are working. I think that's important to consider, how personal approaches are going to become part of pedagogical approaches with the passage of time. And as we were discussing earlier, is there a distinct line between the private and the public? So can family albums be construed as, having the potential for engaging with a certain outer ream of a political life? And how does one engage with the politics by being privately tuned in a way? It also brings to mind the idea of storytelling. This was another archive we were showing called the Stars Archive, from looking primarily at Tamil Nadu and looking at portraiture from Tamil Nadu. But if you have storytelling and testimony as important modalities, we are also thinking today about narratives and counter-narratives. Is there going to be a counter-narrative to the gathering of material that is around the family that stays together, the family that dissipates, the family that does not find itself together but in a photograph is montaged together? This is something that happens quite often. So what is the life of this family photo? What is rather the afterlife of this family photograph? And something I ask myself quite often while we go through the archive is, what is the life, as it were, and character of South Asia that is going to be represented, which is unique to South Asia? How are we going to look at particular histories of image making and production over here? What are they going to say outside here? That means, are we going to have the perspective from the outside in or the inside out? Something to be considered. And so as you have the viewed subject, this is the work of Sukanya Ghosh, who is also looking at her own family archive, and she's here today, and making them into assemblages and optical collages with a series called Isometries. But it brings to the fore this important question about the viewed subject, maybe, but also about viewer subjectivity. How are we going to sort of make those part of our focus today, especially at a time when we are thinking of a certain kind of digital universalism? But that digital universalism has allowed us to think about particular histories and local histories, and maybe that is the productive part of what is going to be maybe deliberated upon a little bit today. We did have also in this exhibition 6 dissertations that were looking at family archives to a great extent. One was the life of Punalur, a well-known photographer post-independence, who also joined the Communist Party and subsequently took photos of not only his family life but party members, which I thought was quite interesting and compelling. We were looking at Sonam Tsering's work, which brings to light questions of exile, citizenship between Tibet and India. All of these very, very important within the context of families going across. And of course, more recently, on right now in Jaipur is the work of Savai Ram Singh, India's first photographer king. But of course, what do we consider this family archive of his to be? It's certainly run as an estate by the family today. They consider all of these images to be part of their family archive. So I'm wondering about the terms of inclusion and exclusion. I'm thinking about how not only are they going to be institutionally formed, but what is the primary purpose of these family images that we're going to volunteer with the passage of time. And so maybe for today, while we look at all of this, it's going to be an open-ended inquiry, very much like Nandan Ghia, another Jaipur-based artist whose spectral emanations we have used. He's used family photos, I suppose, and distorted them, recomposed them, pixelated them. The importance of the theorization is probably important right now, and maybe how the theorization of the family photograph in popular culture can also become a new kind of frontier for image discourses is something I would be really interested to hear about and think about with everyone today. So thank you very, very much, Dipali, and I now give the podium to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahab. Good evening, everybody. I am Dipali Diwan, and I'm the Dan Mishra Curator of South Asian Art and Culture at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. I'm just going to give a few opening remarks, and then we'll move on to presentations from the other speakers as well. I just want to say welcome and how grateful I and my colleagues feel for having this time and space to be able to share with you a project that we've been working on for the last 3 years. We call it the Family Camera Network, and it's very deliberate words, network, because there's a whole bunch of partners. And in many ways, we are at the end of a 3-year grant, over which time we've been doing this project. And so in many ways, we're here to sort of brainstorm and reflect on what the last 3 years have been, but also what are the next steps for us, and being here in India with so many great initiatives going on, and I think a profound interest in family photos in different ways, personal archives, politics of family photos, what is a family photo. I think we're interested in meeting like-minded people who are doing projects around that. And so I guess it's a wonderful way to think about the word network as also a future-facing possibility, possibilities we don't know about yet. So this project called the Family Camera Network really has been a 3-year project focusing on interrogating family photography, and specifically the relationship between family and photography. So not trying to assume we know what those two words conjoined together actually mean. And for most of us, we've been really trying to think through it through a theme of migration, family photography being such a broad thing, it's just a way to sort of narrow it down. We'd like to really thank Tati, Senior Program Officer at the India International Center, for hosting us. She was amazing when we decided we wanted to be able to share our work and get some space. Rahab has been a collaborator and a colleague and a friend for many years. I've been using the Al-Qazi collection of photography for my own research for a long time, and I have to say, you know, I still think it's one of the best archives of photography across South Asia that there is to work with. I really want to thank Jennifer Chaudhary as well, who works with the ACP. She's been facilitating all the arrangements. Also want to thank Professors Surya Nandini Narayan and Kavita Singh at JNU. We'll be holding a little bit of a roundtable with faculty and grad students there tomorrow as a way to further the conversation. And so the welcome has been really wonderful. And I will end by just saying I really want to thank my family as well, my family in Delhi as well as in Mathura. They have been a support system for me for many years whenever I come to India and really throughout my life. So for today's program, basically 4 of us members of the steering committee of the Family Camera Network are going to speak for about 10 minutes. We're going to share with you some of the activities in the project, some of our ideas and outcomes that have kind of come out for the last 3 years, and just to give you a sense of what we found and what our personal interests are in this. And we have very different entry points, I think, into this very large and expansive topic. And we specifically asked, you know, not for a large auditorium, but in fact a seminar room like this. and in order to have a conversation afterwards around it and hear your thoughts as well on some of our questions. So I will just try to briefly introduce my colleagues so you know who is going to be talking, and I will introduce them briefly in the order in which they will speak. So our first speaker will be Dr. Thi Phu. She is an associate professor of English studies at Western University in Ontario, Canada. She's also the principal investigator of the Family Camera Network project. And so this is just grant speak in Canada for meaning the person who wrote the grant and kind of shepherds us all into our various projects. She works on visual representation of race and gender among diasporic communities, and more broadly, the intersections between visual studies, critical race studies, transnational American studies, and trans-Pacific critique. She's the author of Picturing Model Citizens, Civility in Asian American Visual Culture, that was published in 2012. And then she co-edited Feeling Photography, a collection of essays with one of our other speakers, Elspeth Brown. That was published in 2014. And she is the author of a new book called Warring Visions of Vietnam, and that will be forthcoming from Duke University Press. I'll say a few words after her, and as I mentioned, I am a curator at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. My research interests span colonial, modern, and contemporary visual culture, but specifically about South Asia and its diaspora. And the kinds of things I think about really are the production of knowledge, the history of photography in India, art education, and how decorative arts gets linked with historiography. I co-authored a book on Raja Deen Dayal that was actually published by the Al-Kazi Collection. That was in 2013. I authored a book called Embellished Reality, Indian Painted Photographs in 2012, inspired by the Al-Kazi Collection of Photography. And I also edited a book on Bollywood cinema show cards, which really was sort of an extension of my interest in painted photographs. All three were accompanied by exhibitions, and most recently, I served as a guest editor of a special issue on family photos of an online journal called Trans-Asian Photography Review. The third speaker will be Dr. Elspeth Brown, who is professor of history at University of Toronto, where she teaches and does research on queer and trans history, the history of U.S. capitalism, oral history, and the history and theory of photography. She's the author of an award-winning book, The Corporate Eye, Photography and the Rationalization of American Commercial Culture, 1884 to 1829, and also Cultures of Commerce, Representation in American Business Culture, 1877 to 1960. She co-edited the Feeling Photography volume with Thi Phu, and she's the editor of a special issue called Queering Photography of the journal Photography and Culture, and that was in 2014. She also has a new book coming out called Work, exclamation point, A Queer History of Modeling, and that's forthcoming from Duke University Press. And our last speaker is Dr. Sarah Parsons, who is an associate professor of art history and visual culture at York University, also in Toronto. And her research and teaching span contemporary Western, especially Canadian art history, theory and museum practice, and the history of photography. She is the editor of Emergence, Contemporary Canadian Photography, a publication that came out in 2009, and also Photography After Photography, Gender, Genre, and History, which is a volume of essays by Abigail Solomon Goudreau, and that came out in 2017 from Duke. Her research on 19th century Canadian photographer William Notman, one of the big studio photographers in Canada, has been published by the Art Canada Institute and the McCord Museum, where there's a large collection of his work. And she's also the co-editor of a special issue of Photography and Culture called Seeing Family, and that came out in 2017. Her current research focuses on the interconnected histories of privacy and photography. So with that, I will pass the baton to Thi, who will start us off.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for hosting us. I am delighted to be here. I thought I'd get started was exposing myself a little bit in the vulnerability. Appropriately enough, because the subject is family photography, I wanted to talk about my personal entry into family photography. So this blank slide is to kind of get you to conceptualize a moment in history that is really important to my family. It's the war in Vietnam, and I don't need to put up on a PowerPoint what probably is a very recognizable set of images for you, the triumvirate of photographs that kind of epitomize the war in Vietnam. They tend to be spectacles of war and depict Vietnamese suffering. And as I was growing up, my brother and I were inundated with these images because the same documentaries would air ad nauseum on television. And despite Ken Burns' recent attempt at it, at the war, it was the same set of images. And as I was growing up, I kept thinking, there's something troubling about this. I didn't have the language to understand it. And recently, it became very clear to me. This image of the war was how we were seen by, we call it the West, by Americans, by this culture in which we were growing up. But this was not how our family viewed ourselves. And it became especially clear to me when I realized that a set of images that I would continue looking at and returning to as we were growing up was a photo on my aunt's mantelpiece. And it was a photo of her as an 18-year-old bride. And it was taken, just beautiful, wearing bridal attire on the streets of Saigon in front of the Continental Hotel, which is a famous place where a lot of the journalists would congregate. It didn't occur to me until very recently that to ask, when was this photo taken? 1968. 1968, the Tet Offensive. And then when I looked closer at the photograph, it was not just the bride in the foreground, but also the sandbags in the background that served as a reminder that this is a family photo, but it is also a war photo. I'm not so much interested in disrupting genre or cleaving close to genre. I'm interested in understanding what the concept of family, when you deploy it critically, how that can open up new ways of seeing war, and more than that, survival, and those who actually don't survive. So let me show you another photo. I hesitated, as Rahab knows, about whether or not to show you this photo at all. And this is a photo, this is me, and this is my brother in my mother's arms. And we are on an island in Bidang, which is in Malaysia, and 3 months that we were there in a refugee camp. Why would refugees take photographs of themselves? I mean, these were questions that came to my mind as I was growing up in Canada. It's not something that, when friends came over, that I felt compelled to show to them, because this is a history that was very, secret within my family. This is a past that we wanted to overcome, right? So, when people migrate, they migrate for different reasons. And the reasons that we left Vietnam were painful reasons. And yet, there's something about this photograph, as I learned over the years, that actually called us into being. This was a photograph that my family, my parents, wanted to have taken of us, to document not just a passage to a new life, constitution of a family, and incidentally, I don't know everyone who's in there, and I suspect they aren't actually all my family members. So that raises the question of the strangers who appear in our family albums and what that relationship might mean. I'm starting to think that the word family photography, we don't even know what that is, never mind what family actually is. And so these very personal kind of meditations were my entry point into the Family Camera Network. It appears in my own book, but I was very delighted to work with my colleagues in developing the Family Camera Network. This is a still from our website, to develop the Family Camera Network, to explore the personal as an analytic, the personal as a means of understanding and complicating both family and the category, or family and photography, and the tension and that is generative when you bring them together. So the Family Camera Network is a research collaboration and a partnership that consists of 6 institutions that you can see here. 2 of the most important are represented by Dipali Dewan and Elspeth Brown, who will talk a little bit more about the Royal Ontario Museum and the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives and their role in the network. We are a team of 24 researchers, and our objective is to collect and preserve family photography, broadly conceived, along with the stories about them. I began deliberately with stories just to impress upon you the fact that each image, whether or not it has actually been preserved, whether or not it exists, whether or not it belongs to you, whether or not it belongs to you, actually contains a story. And what's interesting to us is even the moments when the stories have been lost, right? When the image has been lost. We have developed a method in order to attempt to preserve as much of the relationship between story and image as possible by pairing image analysis, the actual preservation of the image, alongside the oral histories about them. In our video interviews, we usually include 2 cameras. The first camera focuses on our interviewees, the narrator, and the second camera focuses on their interaction with their photographs. Through post-production, we splice the 2 images together in order to preserve the story along with the photograph. So here's an example of one of the interviews actually taking place. This is happening at the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. There's a couple of reasons why family photography and oral history really work well together. Number one, family photography enables us a way into kind of a history that many institutionalized histories overlook. And oral history has been developed as a methodology within the discipline of history more broadly in order to document marginalized communities. It's histories from below. And in this respect, family photography as like a genre that has usually been sidelined within the history of art, more generally, enables us to provide a counter archive that would help us narrate new histories of migration. We are interested in not just kind of the image itself, who made it, who appears in it, who doesn't appear in it. We're interested in how it circulates. In what contexts are these stories shared? Which stories are not shared? And also, what images are left behind, right? So we often think of a photograph as something that actually exists. But the photographic is a phenomenon or an encounter that can exist in the absence of an actual image. And so this is why oral history has been really crucial in documenting this, because especially in the cases of forced migration and dislocation, often families, when they leave, they leave only with what they can carry, and they are not able to hold on to their family photographs. And so this is a record, the missing, the lost. This is an attempt to preserve that which still remains. And one of the things that I've learned too, as I just want to touch briefly on the strangers in the photographs, one of the things that has been an important lesson for me is, not only the intimate relationships that are documented in family photography, but also how estrangement becomes a crucial way in which we can think about the relationship between the people in the photographs as well as our relationship to the photograph. One that becomes especially pertinent during the process of institutionalization that Rahab has talked about. And with that, I'll give the floor over to my colleagues.
I'll talk a little bit about the manifestation of the project at the Royal Ontario Museum, one of the collecting institutions. And, my entry into being interested in family photos is really through my work on the history of photography in India. And I've been working on this for a long time, and I've been trying to write a book. And I have to say, every time I kind of make some progress, I start feeling really grumpy about all the things I can't write about. And, I have to take that as a clue. Sometimes when I feel grumpy, it ends up being sort of the new research area. And I just felt like, one of the areas that I couldn't really write about in a robust way was the category of family photographs. And, thinking it through of like, okay, so why isn't there more writing about family photographs? And part of it felt like was because there weren't the archives to really do that. And when there were family photographs in collections, whether they be institutional or regional archives, then they seemed to be mostly either orphaned images, so images where we don't really know who the person is, but the photograph comes from the region, or we tend to know who the family is. They tend to be illustrations of family genealogies. So, the people represented, historical figures and such, are the reason why they're there. There's no really archive to give a sense of what is the cultural practice of family photos. So there's no record of people talking about their photos. And so being at an institution where we have collections, it felt like a natural fit and an ability to make a stage for such collections. And a collection that could be public. And that was a really key thing, rather than in my own personal collection or another scholar's personal collection. One that other scholars can actually use to rewrite histories of photography or write different kinds of national histories as well. And so that was one of the sort of motivating things for me. And I think the theme of migration was something that was particularly relevant and resonant as well. And migration just defined very broadly. So whether over short or long distances, whether in the recent or distant past, it seemed like family photographs at some stage or another intersected with an experience of migration. And one of the things that I wanted to think a lot about was how did those images actually mediate those experiences, whether it's through memory, stories that are passed down in a family, or someone's actual experience of movement. And one of the ideas that I've been trying to think through a bit more is really how migration or mobility, quite broadly, is not really a theme for a side theme in family photographs, but really perhaps the motivating theme. And that's an area that I'm interested in photographing and in exploring more as well. So part of the project is collecting photographs at the Royal Ontario Museum, the ROM, which is one of Canada's World Culture and Natural History Museum, founded in 1914 in Toronto. And the nice thing about this institution is that it has a very broad definition of culture. It's not necessarily a quote-unquote fine art institution. And so the idea of family photographs, no one questioned whether they should or shouldn't be collected. It was all sort of part of this category of culture more broadly. Over the 3 years, we reached out, we called for people interested in putting their family photos into an archive. And over that time at the ROM, we collected 15,000 photographs. We have about 40 oral histories that go with them from families. And those collections really range from an entire set of albums that go across 3 generations to a single photo. And at the beginning of the project, we thought, we got a lot of feedback of, like, you're crazy, no one's going to give you their family photos. And the project from the start was never really conceived of as one that was meant to extract images from families that still had meaning and use within the family. But what we did find is that we are in a profound moment of transition right now in family photography, where many families still have analog collections that are either stuck in the cupboards or closets, but almost in whole part, they've transitioned to the digital and are still struggling about what to do with that stuff. And so there's this moment of transition going on where some families had these boxes of family albums and they didn't know what to do with them. And so either, as someone passes away, they often get discarded or sold in estate sales, or a younger generation doesn't want to cart them around. People move around quite a bit, especially in Canada, but they didn't kind of quite throw them away because they still felt like they had value. And so this was some of the motivations that brought people to the archive. And in some cases, for those who really had large family collections that really still had meaning in the family, they still found value in having one photograph. And they liked the idea of having at least one of their family photographs in a mainstream institutional collection, so that one day maybe a historian might want to write about it or use it, to be able to tell different kinds of histories. So this is sort of kind of the range of material that we collected. And I'll just give you a few examples of what kinds of things are in that archive right now. So one of the groups is the Margaret Corey collection, and this was a set of 20 albums by a Canadian expat who traveled across Europe and Asia with her husband, who worked for the United Nations immediately in the post-colonial period when much of the world was going through this, between 1947 and 1965. And these 20 albums, it's very interesting because they're put together by hand. As you can see, this is just a one page from it. And they are very deliberately constructed, and there's an entire narrative where there's not only photos on a page, but she has this running typescript narrative through the entire album. And, was her niece that decided, there's not so much value for them in her home, but she wanted to see them in the museum collection. And it was her niece that we interviewed for the oral history. And through that interview, we were able to discern that basically the purpose of these albums was not so much her own souvenirs to bring back home after her travels, but in fact, kind of a love letter home to her mother. And it was a way for her mother to sort of stay connected to her daughter's life as she traveled around year after year with her husband. And in many ways, these albums, they show her as a person observing the world, photographing it, translating it in some ways for her mother, but then also mixed with trips homes. And it's a collection that I think really can think about how travel to other places have framed ideas of citizenship and that relationship between the self and the nation, whether it's the one she calls home or the one that she's been traveling to. Another set of photographs mark different kinds of relationship between family photography and migration. Some actually are taken in transit. So, for example, on the top left is a photograph taken in 1968, I believe, at the Bombay airport. And so this is from a family album in Toronto, but it was the moment of migration. So in the 60s, when a lot of Indians were migrating to the West in different places, there were professional photographers at the airport to document that moment. And so this particular one, there's only two of them, and the little baby in the carriage right at the bottom, you can see who were migrating to Canada. But the whole family came, everybody's dressed up, and the professional photographer is there to take the photo. And what's so interesting about this one is that you have to imagine it's not that the print was immediately produced. And so there was a process of taking down the address and printing later, and then either sending it to the local family who then sent it abroad, and there might have been multiple copies made. So I'm really interested in this idea that there's a whole history of Indian photography in diasporic family albums. The other photo of the small boy that you see is connected to a whole collection of images of a family who migrated from Vietnam among that refugee migration that T described. And in this case, they were one of the few families that actually brought their family photos with them. And this little boy, Han Lu, his mother was the family photographer and chronicler. And so she valued family photos quite a bit, and in fact sent for those family photos after they had already fled. And they came on a different boat, even when the members of the family who sent them, in fact, didn't survive. So it was just the family photos that survived. And in this photo here, he's pictured in transit in the Hong Kong airport before they got their visas to Canada. And all the family photos are in that little white and green box behind him. And so these are some of the kinds of stories coming out in the oral histories that if one found this image in a bookstore or, a estate sale or the paper bazaar, you would never know the layers of histories like that. Another example, sometimes photos travel when people don't or can't. And so this is an example actually from my own personal history, where you can see, in fact, the notations written on the back of images are almost as important as the images themselves. And this one shows actually me and my sister standing there in little dresses. And this was an image that I found in my dadi's albums, my grandmother's albums, after she passed away, which had been sent to her by my parents. And on the back of it, and it's an image I had never seen before, and on the back of it, my mother had written a little note talking about how, isn't it funny if you look at the image, you can see Dipali refusing to hold her sister's hand for the photo or something like that. And it's meant to create a sense of intimacy between family despite the distance. And so photos traveling when people can't. And I just wanted to stop with this because this is a collection we just recently took in, and we can't forget when we think about expansive ideas about family, who in fact gets pride of place in our family photo frames. Sometimes it's absolutely the family's pet. So I just want to talk quickly about just two outcomes of this project that I've been personally involved in. One was this exhibition that Rahab had mentioned at the Royal Ontario Museum. We did one called The Family Camera that explored ideas of family photography and migration. And it was done for Canada's sesquicentennial, so 150th anniversary. And in this exhibition, there was actually several sections that focused on things like childhood photography and the iconography of childhood photography, and how Kodak played a big role in producing the birthday photo. I bet you every one of us have a birthday photo and it looks kind of the same. Well, where did that iconography come from? Is it just natural? Or was it actually produced out of intersection of different forces, commercial and otherwise? We had a section on Niagara Falls photography in Canada. And Niagara Falls is a space where, in fact, huge amount of visitors from abroad, diasporic people as well as Canadians, they make their pilgrimage every now and then to Niagara Falls, and it becomes this photo moment. And it's not the place where in the past there used to be professional photographers here. It's very much a moment of the snap and click, instantaneous photo. And then another example is a section on cameras in this exhibition, where we tried to show a history of how the camera itself, the family photo camera, as it became smaller and more portable, kind of contains these histories in its physicality of portability, of mobility, of affordability. And so in some ways, this idea of mobility being built right into the very technology and trajectory of the technology of the camera, the family camera. And so rather than, the big, fancy, expensive cameras that often appear in photography shows, we chose the cheapest, most mass-produced cameras we could find to show this history, including the little cardboard Kellogg's Cornflakes camera that you could mail in for with 3 box tops. And then the other thing that I've been involved in most recently is this online journal, the Trans-Asian Photography Review. And I'll just say that one of the things that really came out of this, it's a number of articles on family photographs across Asia. And this special issue was not really about family photos produced in Asian spaces, but very self-consciously about how Asian spaces produced forms of visuality that enhance our understanding of family photographs. And so the essays ranged across photo practice from 19th century to the present day. They spanned types of photographs, from the snapshot, studio portrait, to the album, to fine artwork, as well as the photo advertisement, and often blurring boundaries between each. And there was a couple kind of big outcomes, big takeaways from this journal issue that I'm quite excited about. And one of the things was really about how, for many of the authors, the personal family archive was the starting point for them. And I think sometimes the personal sort of, doesn't get enough credit for being a place of inquiry, a place of critique, where some of the most intriguing questions about the genres that we deal with at institutional levels can start. And then the other thing that really came out about it is just the range of the range of notions of what is a family photograph. And I think that when we started this project, this idea of the family photograph, it was interesting how many people had very strong notions of what is a family photograph. And if you went kind of beyond it, there were strong reactions that absolutely not, it couldn't be. But what these authors do is really think about how family photographs can be quite expansive. They can be studio portraits, they can be state portraits. In one case, in fact, in a space where there's, in spaces of violence, where family photos become images where the only interpretation is either it becomes an image of someone who's died or someone who's about to die. The artwork becomes the entry point into thinking about family. How do you recreate the family photo through the artwork? And one of the essays talks about that. And in another one, it's about how an entire village is in fact tangentially related. And so what is not a family photo from that region? So I think I will end with that and ask my next colleague to come up, Elspeth.
Thank you so much for coming today. It's really great to see such a wonderful turnout, and I look forward to having a conversation with you after the presentations. So I'm representing one of the two organizations that are collecting organizations for the Family Camera Project. This is the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, which is located in Toronto. It was founded in 1973 as primarily a kind of gay liberation archive. Homosexuality was decriminalized in Canada in 1969, which doesn't mean, of course, that the police weren't involved with all sorts of shenanigans vis-a-vis sexuality for decades afterwards, but nonetheless, legally, this organization was founded sort of in the wake of decriminalization, but was fundamentally a kind of archive of activists that documented that generation's history, which is primarily a white, gay, cisgendered population. So in terms of Rahab's questions around the institutionalization, we're kind of seeing a shift here at the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives as the archives start to reflect the much more diverse population of the city. We began collecting a bit later than the ROM, so we had the fabulous opportunity to learn from their mistakes and from their experience, which we very much appreciated. We started interviewing in the late spring of 2017. We continued through December. We ended up interviewing about 15 people and collecting their photographs. And these are people mostly who have histories of migration in one way or another. So we ended up interviewing people from India, from Vietnam, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Jamaica, and other locations globally. And one of the differences that we had with the ROM is that our population was, for the most part, skewed a bit younger. So folks weren't always willing at that point to kind of let go of their original analog photographs, many of which, some of those photographs, in fact, belonged to their parents. So we ended up digitizing some of the analog photographs and returning the originals, but we also collected a lot of born digital images as well as some home movies as well, because of course today with cell phones, it's just easy to take a 30-second video as it is to take a snapshot. So in terms of the context of queer and trans families, people from gender and sexual nonconforming backgrounds generally refer to families of origin, which is the families where folks came from, and also families of choice, which is perhaps a slightly older language, but it's a way of kind of distinguishing between where one came from in terms of one's parents, etc., siblings, but also the kinds of ways in which queer and trans people have needed to make different kinds of families in order to survive, sometimes in the case of rejection from families of origins, or also often the context of migration from rural areas to urban areas, trajectories that many queer and trans people take in order to find folks with whom they can connect. And of course, more recently, families are getting more complicated as well, because in Canada anyway, many queer and trans people are also having children of their own, right? So there's a whole other level of complexity around family and the queer and trans context. But if I can, I'd like to just play about a 1-minute clip from one of our narrators, Courtney, who talks a little bit about this queer notion of family as being about families of choice as opposed to family of origin. And hopefully the technology will work, and if it doesn't, I will simply explain and we will move on. So let's see if this happens.
It's really interesting. It's not this notion of family and as queer identified folk, we've already kind of sort of problematized some of that construction of that sort of nuclear family, that idea of a family is only blood and biology, etc. And and so when thinking about this project and the notion of family, family for me has been, I've broadly defined it. It's the family into which I was born, as well as the family I, at different stages of my life have chosen. And within the queer context, I think, that family that has nurtured me and supported me and, and kept me alive, I really feel like literally, is as much a part of my life and as significant in my life, and sometimes even more significant in my life than the biological family. Even though I think I'm fortunate enough to have, maintained really strong connections to that family of origin.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about one of the outcomes for this portion of the project, which is an exhibition that T and I co-curated last spring called Queering Family Photography. And in this exhibition, we're very interested in exploring this alternative notion of family that I've been describing a little bit. And the exhibition included photographs from the oral histories that we had collected as part of Family Camera Network, but also from the archival collections at the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, and then also from the Two-Spirited collection at the University of Winnipeg, which had been donated by Two-Spirited activist Albert McLeod. And the exhibition included over 125 photographs, two vitrines of photograph albums, and an 18-minute video, which was comprised of clips from our oral history interviews. So the show in general explored the critical work that queer, trans, and two-spirited family photos do in both documenting as well as creating queer modes of belonging. It's how the emotional attachments of queer family photographs have also sustained LGBTQ2+ lives. And the show traced how queer, trans, and two-spirited people draw on photography to kind of stretch the frame of family, to include queer kinships outside the heteronormative nuclear family model. And also the show considered the social, political, and technological factors that structure families and the creative ways that LGBTQ+ people have reimagined kinship. We broke the exhibition into 4 sections. First section was entitled Instant Intimacies, and it featured Polaroid prints from the 1970s to the 1990s, because Polaroids as a technology, of course, were developed on site. They're kind of instantaneous photography. One did not need to send them out to labs in order to get prints, and as a result, they have often been a preferred technology for queer and trans people who don't want to risk public exposure by sending out their photographs to the lab for development. And although Polaroid declared bankruptcy some time ago, now, of course, we have smartphones, and it's the influence of social media and smartphones and applications such as Skype persists in our present era of social media, which embraces spontaneity and immediacy, not unlike these older phenomena of the instant cameras. Another section was on domesticities, which considers the spaces where families, broadly defined, are formed and remade as activists, aunties, lovers, parents, all the multiple modes in which queer kinship gets constituted. And often gay people have turned to public spaces to find community and to survive, because domestic space has often been, of course, a site of surveillance and control and refusal for queer and trans lives. So the section included how domestic images document more than just the so-called private sphere. They also redefine domesticity as an ideology that shapes gender roles and also polices sexuality. And the section described the generational bonds between parents and children, between romantic partners, and even between strangers who, despite the brevity of their connection, come together in defiance of norms that have historically criminalized queer desire and gender expression. Our third section was entitled Publics, and it highlighted the spaces where the intersections between these spheres are most visible and where domesticity is often overtly politicized. And these spaces include the spectacle of parades as well as quotidian sites of encounter, including the streets of the gay village in Toronto, and less visible ones such as bathhouses, a pivotal venue for the expression of queer desire that has often been the target of state suppression. And publics also included how events such as powwows afford an opportunity to reflect on two-spirited kinship and relationship to indigenous cultures and queer modes of belonging. Finally, this particular section had a feature of photographs, of Vincent Poe's photographs of the gay village, which is at this point historically getting quite heavily gentrified and pushing out low-income folks in a way that continues to marginalize LGBTQ people on the basis of class and race. We also were involved with making possible the show of an associated exhibition by the London-based photographer Sunil Gupta. And Sunil Gupta had sort of come out in Montreal in the 1970s when he was there. And for this exhibition, he drew on his archival work from the 1970s. And he also went back and interviewed a fair number of people that he had photographed in the 1970s about those photographs. And so that work was also on display in an adjacent gallery. We had also a public program that featured Sunil along with Albert McLeod as main speakers and filmmaker Richard Fung and T&I as part of the exhibition. So for me, a few ideas have come out of the work, but also kind of remain consistent as a theme in terms of my own research around this work. One is basically how queer and trans people have repurposed the genre's conservative photographic conventions for unintended ends. And I say that because within the historiography of photography, family photography is really seen as a kind of conservative genre, a normalizing discourse. And in many ways, of course, this is certainly true, particularly when you think about it in relationship to larger commercial formations like Kodak, and there's a lot of ideological work that happens around the traditional family photograph and how families are defined and how one is meant to comport themselves before the camera and how and why that's the case. This is what most of the historiography on the field of family photography has emphasized. But what's been important for me in looking at this work is the ways in which these very same conventions can actually work in opposition to some of these norms by producing a kind of strategy of resistance and resilience for queer people who often don't see themselves represented in, it's sort of similar to what T was talking about in terms of her own relationship to her own family photographs in contrast to the public discourse of the war in Vietnam. So family photographs can do that incredibly important emotional work of creating a sense of belonging and connection when you might not otherwise see it. That's true for many people of color, but it's also true certainly for queer and trans people, many of whom are people of color, of course, themselves. So that's one of the key outcomes for me, which is the kind of important work that these photographs do in making queer belonging visible to queer communities themselves. And they're kind of, in that way, sort of archives of resiliency and resistance. And then the second thing is, again, another theme that we've talked about, which is the ways in which these family photography as a genre is such a complicated concept, and perhaps we can talk about that a bit later, because some of the photographs that make their way into queer and trans family photograph albums are not your typical family photographs. Like, for example, you might see a driver's license with a photograph of from your driver's license in a family album because it signifies a marker as a person changes gender from male to female or female to male, and the opportunity, the possibility of having that marked on identification photographs will then place that driver's license, weirdly enough, in the context of a family photograph album. So there are ways in which it's not about the type of photograph it is, but it's how it is that the photograph is being seen and used and understood, and the different kinds of meanings that people are making of those family photographs. And again, I think that's something that, it's a set of questions I think we all share in different ways in relationship to the project overall. But with that, I think I will stop and turn it over to my next colleague.
Thank you. This is quite an amazing turnout. Again, thank you for having us. So I'm going to return us, I think, to some of the themes that Rahab introduced at the beginning when he was talking about artists working with family as an idea for their photographic practice. I'm an art historian, and I teach in an art department. I teach mostly artists, emerging artists. And so that's really been my entry point into this project, is to really think about the role that artists play and the kind of work they do around questions of family. And that really takes several forms in this project. You saw some of the examples where artists have been brought into exhibitions, but one of the other outcomes, certainly for me, a priority was to think about teaching around this theme of family photography. I teach regular surveys of history of photography, but I particularly teach a senior undergraduate seminar on contemporary photography. And I generally pick themes for it. And this time around, the last time I taught it around questions of family and photography. And it was fascinating to me how much that changed the way I taught the course. In the same way that the larger project is, among our other goals, is to think about the different kinds of histories that you can tell if you look at photographs in a different frame. So, the kinds of diasporic queer histories that we can tell about Canada now, even just through our small little archive, that's quite different from the kinds of histories that we're able to tell, or that we default to telling, as T was talking about, in terms of those iconic images. So I'm interested in looking at the artists, partly because that's where I teach and that's what I think about, but also because artists often sort of point us in new directions before we can fully articulate in words where we're going. And so I'll introduce a couple of the artists that I've written more about that I certainly teach in my class. I've always taught them in this seminar because they're the things that I write about most. But they get reframed when the whole course was about issues of family and photography. So this is Sally Mann's American photographer, Southern American photographer, who became kind of infamous in the early 90s for using her children as the mainstay of a big project called Immediate Family. And she created this kind of quirky family album that was very aestheticized, often posed pictures, and she received massive blowback for producing images, for including her children, for publicizing them, for producing images like the wet bed, where the feeling was that she had exposed very intimate moments of her children's lives, and in many cases that they seemed somewhat sexualized, or that they could be read that way. And so I was particularly interested in writing about Sally Mann in the ways that this critique of her work feels very gendered. Art always draws from personal experience, and if your life experience at that for a long period of time is very all-consuming as a mother, as a parent, and you choose to turn your camera on that, she was really violating often rather unspoken boundaries between public and private, and I'm not setting aside questions of consent and ethics, but certainly I think that the historiography of the Sally Mann's Immediate Family Project is a really interesting one that gets us to think a lot about the assumptions we have about mothers and about creativity and about what a mother's role is in terms of visualizing. It's interesting too to kind of look back at this work now in the world of mommy bloggers, which are, just throwing every detail of their children's lives on the international stage, and it seems much less problematic than it once did. Similarly, I've written about Nan Goldin, and in this case, much more about questions of ethics and consent. But this really points to some of the things that Elspeth was talking about. The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, a project that she produced in the 80s, is well known for all sorts of really legitimate reasons. I mean, she really was one of the first to explore the snapshot aesthetic and elevate it to an artistic form, to set a narrative created by a series of not necessarily sequential images set to music. But among those 700 images, she really did conjure an incredible sense of family of choice. And in fact, although she was in a heterosexual relationship for much of the time she was producing this work, her relationship with her boyfriend Brian a lot of these images look really alienated and eventually turns very violent, and she documents that quite carefully. And that's sort of in contrast to many of the images of her larger queer circle, which are very joyous often. Not that the work smooths over the traumas of drug addiction and the AIDS crisis, but there are real moments of connection, and this idea that family and the intimate familial relationships that sustain you may not be through blood, that they may in fact be through other kinds of relationships, the ones that we choose and nurture and sustain through doing rather than being, is one of the ways she's described it. So those are the artists that I've often written about. And then she actually moves on after The Ballad of Sexual Dependency to do a project that uses a much more traditional photographic aesthetic and really focused on families explicitly, and in this case on sort of this kind of caregiving. But when I reframed the whole seminar around family photography, some really interesting, not family photography in the clear sense, but the idea of family and bringing photography together. When I reframed it that way, something really interesting happened, which is that all the white male cis photographers that I had often written about fell off the charts. They're not very interested in questions of family. And I think that harkens back to larger issues within the project, which is that straight white men, their history, their personal histories are our public histories. They're written. They don't feel a great need to find other places to mine those histories. And when I started asking, which photographers are working around these questions, suddenly I had tons of women photographers, tons of people of color, transnational migration, all of that really came into focus without, just quite organically. And one of the artists that I teach regularly, but who started to have real resonance, and my students started to have a lot more complex things to say when I taught it in this context, was Jeff Thomas, who is also a photographer, contemporary Canadian photographer, who we invited to participate in the Family Camera exhibition at the ROM in a commission project. But he started working on family and photography way back in the 80s when he started photographing his son, Bear, on their days spent together. He and his mom were split, so he had very concentrated times with Bear, and they would do a lot of walks in Toronto. And he was really struck. It started with this image, Cultural Revolution, where you have this little boy wearing a hat that you unfortunately can't see, but it has a representation of an Edward Curtis photograph of an Indigenous figure. Sort of this, and against this backdrop of cultural revolution. And he was really struck by this sense of, here's this kid who's being raised in a world where there's sort of a set sense of what an Indian is, and yet the reality of this kid living in the city and walking and seeing these representations around him is really profound. And this project continues. Like Sally Mann's son, Emmett, Bear goes through a period where he refuses to participate, and his father honors that, but they come back to the project. And so there's also this sense that it's a really communal exploration they're undertaking together as a family to kind of try to figure out what it means to be a contemporary subject who is Indigenous in a place where historical stereotypes are embedded visually everywhere. So this is like one of so many sculptures in and around Toronto, Ottawa, all those places that feature supplicant imagery around or stereotyped images of Indigenous peoples. Another artist who I taught in the seminar and who we invited to be part of that project is Dinh Q. Lee, and this is the Crossing the Farther Shore, a Vietnamese-American artist, and this work really relates to some things that T was talking about in terms of the missing photographs. His work, this project has been created from masses of photographs that he bought in Vietnam, photographs that had, vernacular, often family photographs that had been abandoned, that he purchased and he stitched together to create these amazing shapes. and structures, and they really draw you in, and you start to, you're reading the backs of the photographs. Not that I can read Vietnamese, but actually I think T's mom recognized somebody in an image, so she thought she did, or an image or a uniform. So this is really an exploration, again, of another layer, a way in which one might start to point towards these ideas and themes in ways that are really generative. But the way I started that seminar was because my students are mostly artists, and I really wanted them to feel kind of connected to where we were going with this and some ideas about how we might open up questions of family and photography. I asked my students, I said, maybe someone would like to volunteer some personal example of how you think your family has used family photographs, or how they've surfaced in your life in interesting ways. And I was really, I work at a very diverse and multicultural university, and I got such interesting and enthusiastic answers from a student whose family had immigrated to Canada about 20 years ago from South Asia, and all of the marriages in her family were arranged and had been arranged through photographs. And one of the things that she started talking about during the course of the seminar was, she said, I really want to go back and ask my relatives, how their relationship to those original photographs changed over time, how they have different kinds of investments in those photographs than they once did. And then I did have quite a lot of queer students who really reflected on the pain and anguish of being removed from their family photographs. And then really everyone's favorite was this amazing student who said that her grandmother has framed photographs of all of her grandchildren on a table in her hallway. And at family dinner on Sunday night every week, she rearranges them from best grandchild to worst grandchild based on some weird matrix that has to do with academic achievement and obedience, but mainly to the grandmother. And the student was from Korea, and she said, it's a Korean thing. And I can't tell you how many arms went up in the room, said that's not a Korean, that has resonance in many different families. And I really think that sense of the personal as a starting place for all of us is important, and something that is that often as scholars and as artists people receive some pushback on. And I think one of the goals of our project has been to kind of rethink that personal as a critical starting place. And so thank you very much.
So we have a little time right now for a few questions, but thank you very, very much for those presentations / talks. It sort of made one think about the questions of subjectivity, objectivity, while I was thinking about this while approaching photographs. But of course, with that kind of a discussion, I suppose one has to think of more creative and personal ways of addressing images rather than as disembodied, but very much embodied, very much something that you can hold on to and carry with you. With that, I would like to open the discussion to the audience for a few questions. We have about 10 minutes, I think, for discussion, so fire away.
I just wanted to ask about, based on your talk about how you approach consent when using family albums. Does the responsibility for, because generally it's more complex, like somebody took the photograph, but it might contain a lot of intimate information about others who may not be aware that the image is being given to an archive and will be then made public. For example, like I once wanted to use some home videos that my dad had taken, and my mom was uncomfortable, and then I was like, oh, but he said it's fine, and she's like, of course he'd say it's fine, he's behind the camera. So, is there an approach that you have to this issue?
That's a really great question, and we spent a long time talking about the most responsible way of addressing it. I mean, there's the legal question and the ethical question. The legal question is pretty clear cut. You ask who the photographer is, who owns it. But when we developed our various consent forms, there are multiple levels of consent, and we always return to the donor through every single use that we have for the photograph. So the first is the donation, right? We ask if they are indeed the owner of the photograph, and to the best of their knowledge, are they the ones who are permitted to donate it? If we wish to use it in an exhibition, thus far our practice has been to return to the donor and to ask them whether or not they would be comfortable with us including it in the exhibition. We always return. And in some cases, even the Honolulu donor participant that Dipali was talking about, we wanted to use one of his photographs, and he said his uncle was not comfortable with being represented. To get to your question, because this is the complexity of family photographs, it's not just the photographer or the person being photographed, it's everybody else that's being photographed, right? There are multiple times, I think, in which we've had people say, no, we're not comfortable, but to return to Dipali's important point, this is not an extractive project. We are concerned with, I mean, this is a public archive, and our primary responsibility is to the participants in the project. And we would never use any image that they felt uncomfortable with being used. Yeah.
Just to also answer that, that's a great question. We actually contacted every single person who's represented in every single image, and it was very hard because people have broken up, sometimes people aren't talking to each other. It's like, you open up old wounds by accident. But ethically, we felt that was really important to do. And in some cases, we didn't actually use the photographs. And there was also a large collection of photographs that had just been donated to the archives from the Two-Spirited Peoples of the First Nation, which is an indigenous organization of queer and Two-Spirited people. And we didn't use many of those photographs at all because we hadn't yet gone through that very important process of circling back to that community and having a process around who's in the photographs and that sort of thing. But it's a great question.
One, of course, I was going to ask you a little bit about how do you deal with the digital, because there's going to be so much of profusion of imagery now with stuff that's traveling on the internet. I mean, that's the new family album, Facebook, and there's so much of that happening there. So how does a project like this deal with that? The other thing that came to my mind when you were talking about, all of you talked about narratives, and you talked about that very interesting example of how you were shooting with 2 cameras and you were always looking at the way somebody was actually handling the album. And I was thinking that that's one person's memory around the photograph, but then there are always these multiple memories, selected memories around photographs. So, there are 2 people in a picture, it's likely that 2 people will have very different memories about that photograph. And how does one bring, because it's so complicated. I mean, it's not just one person's photograph, but if I'm in a photograph with a little girl in England, which is where I grew up, then it's as much her photograph as much as mine. And so how does one deal with something like that? It's complicated, I guess.
I think that our approach to oral history is very much, the person's telling the story, that's their stories. This is not the history of the photo, it's not the narrative of the family. And I think that that is key in sort of how we're approaching it. It's their story about the photo. Someone else would have an entirely different one. In some of our interviews, there was more than one person, and in fact, one that I did, the whole family came, and while there might have been 1 or 2 people talking mostly, there was a few instances where I was like, well, that's not right, or, but that disagreement was as integral a part of the oral history as not, and so, how you use that data, whether it be the photo or the oral history, is the question, and I think each person who uses that data needs to answer that and grapple with that, and I think it's, so there's that. And then the first part is, born digital. It's digital images, or born digital images, is the key question I feel like we always get asked, especially by archives and museums and things. And as a project, we decided that pretty early on that you can't just kind of stop arbitrarily at the year 2000, roughly, when analog kind of gave way and digital started, especially with family photos. And so we sort of really left it open. And I can tell you for my institution, I would say CLGA was far ahead of the ROM in this manner, already having cloud space and hard drive space to be able to store digital images. The ROM is like decades behind that and just thrown my entire museum into a tizzy. But interestingly, no one has said don't do it. So I've just done it. And it's really been a collaboration with the families. And I think that's maybe another point, is that none of us have served as the curator, selecting amongst people's family photos, saying, well, take this, not take that. There's a space issue, yes, you know, like that's a consideration, but really the images that have come into the collection have been entirely chosen by the families. And so some of them have said, here's a pen drive, you know? And, you know, I have to say, I actually tried to participate in an artist project before we started this project, who was also kind of collecting family photos, and I had brought like a disc or a pen drive with mine, and I have to tell you, I was turned away, because it turned out they only wanted analog. And it felt so horrible and so like rejecting that I said, you know, I am never going to do that in this project. You know, digital images and the way they circulate, how can you do a project on family photos and mobility and migration and not go into the digital? You know, there's an entire, you know, world out there in terms of the way families share photos, and it's absolutely on social media. And how they keep photos, right? And they're scanning analog photos. So some of the digital images we have, the born digital images that we have in the collection are scans of analogs. And that's okay too, because that's, the digital image has a materiality to it also. And it's not so much the analog, it's when did that digital image get born and what was it used for? It's very different than that analog. So these kinds of layers of things, we're only starting to scratch the surface, but really, I think, tried to be expansive and not constrictive.
Also, I feel there could be an emotional element attached. I would, you know, come up with my grandmother's pictures. I would not give it to anybody, maybe like it to my immediate family. Even to show, I would just show it to my immediate family. A digital, somehow I would not feel so connected with than a physical, you know, thing in my hand. So I would share a digital than a physical thing. And I would scan and show it to you maybe.
And interestingly, you know, these are, I think, different affective responses we have. Really, that's only, what, 2 decades old now? You know, that sort of experience. There was.
You use digital techniques to enhance the original image, make it clearer without distorting it or without creating characteristics which are not there. Does it make it more genuine or less genuine when you do that?
So our collecting practice would be absolutely no manipulation whatsoever. It comes as it comes, even if it's an emailed photo. And we've started to develop techniques where, in fact, there's software called Baggett. It follows, in fact, you know, physical museum practices where you take the image, the digital image, you put it in the Baggett, and it marks, it creates a digital signature of like what that image was. And so it tracks if any pixels wear away. So treating the born digital as an artifact, you know, trying to create a cold storage in the cloud. Now, my museum hasn't quite got so far as we need actually a collection manager to watch the stuff, you know, and make sure it gets preserved, and what if technology changes, what do you do? You were asking about one of the things. Now, interestingly, this idea of the making it better, enhancing, correcting it, one of the things that we've collected is a shoebox of rejected family photos, the ones that didn't make it into the album. So there was a family who, you know, showed me the album, and there were all these beautiful photographs in it, and they said, well, here's the box of the copies or the blurry shots that didn't make it into the album. You can have that. And I said, great, I love it, you know, the ones that didn't make it in. And those are profoundly interesting too.
I'm just curious about one particular thing, which is whether, given that the idea of the family is really important across societies and everything, whether there was a contrast between the ways people were narrating the family and whether the sense of falling apart of the family, or the sense that kinship really sort of, I mean, family is just one it's sort of subsumed by a larger concern over kinship and friendship. Did you hear about those stories sort of commingling perhaps somebody is saying that the family is not this extended sort of large family or a nuclear family, it's about one particular kinship node or something, or the stress on an expansive idea of a family which includes huge groups of kins or imagined kins. We get one sense of that from the sort of chosen family versus the family we're born with, especially with the queer subgroup work. But what about the others? Did they sort of deal with the family as a sort of always fragmented unit, or something that could be less or more than what it is imagined to be?
Some of the interviews, and certainly the papers that Elspeth and the group of us have written, we emphasize the ways in which family photographs and the stories about family photographs are all, to some extent, aspirational fictions. And some of those aspirations are to a sense of unity that may not actually exist. And this is perhaps why the oral histories are important. So even though they stop short of admitting to family rifts, so recall that a lot of the participants are self-selecting in this project, and they're not necessarily going to be the ones who say, I can't stand my mother. But you can hear, if you listen carefully, instead of filling in the silences and the pauses, I think that those stories come about through the not telling as well. So this is perhaps one example of that, and perhaps you can come up with others.
I think it was very much there, and there were several interviews where I could tell, there was in the decorum, in the sense of, trying to be very polite about someone they were talking about, maybe in the photo. You could sense that there was other things, there were silences and things unsaid. And I think this is just the nature of oral history. It's a text to be interpreted as well, and just as any text is. And so, that's not what is said, but also what is not said. And there were several, instances that families said, okay, stop recording, and then take one of us aside and say, I'm not going to talk about this. I don't want this on record, or I don't want this preserved, and then we'd start over, And so there was this sense that of trying to create a space, certainly that was safe enough that, people were conscious they were recording things. We also, said you don't have to decide whether we can keep this or not until after the interview. See how it goes, listen to it again and decide then. And so I feel like that sort of narration of family, can be read in multiple ways. Each oral interview can be read in multiple ways. And I think the fragmentariness of family and the fracture comes out as much as, the expansive definition of it.
Thank you so very much, steering committee of the Family Camera Network. And no, thank you also, because it seems like it's, as you've mentioned so many times, generative. It's a process by which you have actually come up with a methodology, or are still coming up with a methodology. And I think that is very, very interesting. I was thinking about it, but does an initiative like the Family Camera Network really exist in many places? I mean, are there precedents to this that one can take from? And if not, and if there are, sort of, what is the sort of guiding principle of it? Because as I came to this discussion at the beginning, I was thinking about what will the institution do to, this narrative of or genre of, only to realize through the discussion that it's about giving certain continuity to family, where families can be very provisional or separate and fragment. They can come together with the institution as well. So thank you for that. Thank you very, very much. We look forward to having you back here very, very often. And with that, I guess we call it an evening. Thank you very much.